Welcome to This Club Sucks, grief support for parents after the lasagnas are long gone. I am your host, Melissa Monroe, here with my co-host, Alexandria Seamock. Each week we record our child loss chat on Twitter Spaces, where we explore topics around grief and trauma. Whether you are a bereaved parent, want to support bereaved parents, or exploring other sources of grief, we'll be here holding space after the lasagnas are long gone.
Oh, this club sucks.
Today's topic is shame and grief. And our guest is Susan Lynch, a wonderful author, bereaved mother, dog trainer. Has written a beautiful book about the loss of her son, Kevin, and how she uses dog training as a way to give back, an account of his death. But Susan has a lot to say on the topic of, on today's topic, which is shame. So, Susan, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Thank you. I'm really thankful that you invited me on to talk about which I think is spoken about enough. My name is Susan Lynch. I guess I identify first off as being a mom. I was a mom when I was 21, so that's kind of my first job as an adult. I'm the mother of two boys. My oldest son is 34, and my youngest, Kevin, died when he was 25 in 2015 from multiple drug intoxication. Took me a long time to be able to say that out loud and publicly. So because of the stigma that surrounds overdose and, public perception of that way, because most people think it's, kind of two sides where you die from something that was completely out of your control versus, something that you potentially caused yourself. So, yeah, so that's me. I was a dog trainer for over 20 years before Kevin died, and that all came to a stop after he died. And I spent the next 5 years or so really diving deep into my grief and figuring out ways how to heal from that. And having both the grief and the shame on top of that, and how detrimental that was to my healing process. So that's me.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Susan. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you sharing your heart and your story. I know that it will resonate and help many, many people. Susan's book, Life After Kevin, is a beautiful book. And in it, she has a number of beautiful quotes, but she has a chapter entitled Bad Ways to Die. And I think that really cuts to the quick about the potential for shame during grief. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But one of the things I wanted to explore today is how common shame is, first of all. And let's just go back to the difference between shame and grief. Shame, I think it was Brene Brown that said, shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad. And no one is inherently, well, I mean, if you read politics, then maybe you have some opinions on some people who are inherently bad. But there's ideally no shame or guilt in grief. We get to grieve. It's a natural process. But those feelings come up, and they're very common. But shame in particular thrives in secrecy, which Susan so eloquently notes with her title. There's a HuffPo article that Dr. A is posting in the Nest and in the comments. And it says, "You have permission. Our failure to allow ourselves to fully immerse in grief sabotages the enactment of an action and showing up in life." We have to have that permission to grieve. And we need to be able to do it openly to heal. I think it's David Kessler that says something like, being heard is the most, he says it better than this, but I wish I could remember the quote off the top of my head, but something like, having your story heard is the biggest act of healing. So, Susan, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about your experience with shame during grief. And then later we're going to talk about the experience of grief shaming, where people are shamed by other people for grieving, period. But first I wanted to talk to you, Susan, about your experience and your feelings of shame during your grieving process.
So just to get back to the David Kessler part, he said, your grief needs to be witnessed.
That's right. Thank you.
And that's what support groups do. They witness your story. My experience with shame was that, well, first of all, I didn't know how he died. We had to wait for a toxicology report to come back. We had to wait 4 months. So in the meantime, everybody, that if I told somebody that my son had died, they would say, well, how did he die? And they just skipped right over the fact that he died and wanted to get to the details. And the details were, well, unknown in the beginning. But then when I did know, it was like, if I said in my mind, because I never told people. I kept it a secret for 2 years. So I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anybody. So I would just say, well, we don't know yet. We're not sure. They were partying, and that was my answer. And I would get the look like, oh yeah, okay. And whether it was perceived or not, I think part of it, people were figuring it out in their own head and kind of having their thoughts on their, kind of wearing their face on their sleeve kind of thing. But, and it was just, it made me not want to leave my house. I didn't want to run into people. I was always having that, if I run into somebody, do I tell? Do I not tell? How do I steer this conversation? It was completely me controlling how to avoid getting asked what happened or how did he die. So that was what I ended up doing. I ended up doing exactly what Brene Brown says shame needs, is to keep it a secret. I will say that when Kevin died, when we found out that it was, opioids were involved, it was, I didn't know that he was doing those kinds of drugs before he died. So I was dealing with the death, and then I also had dealing with how he died. So it was kind of a double hit for me. And I couldn't I had to untangle those emotions and that, how I felt, the complicated feelings, how I felt about all that privately. And I didn't want to have that out in the public up for judgment. So that was my initial course on how I navigated through the grief. I couldn't bear to have my family or some acquaintance think differently of Kevin because of how he died. That was completely unacceptable to me. So I had to get okay. not okay, but I had to process that within myself so I could be confident enough to say, hey, look, you know what? If you feel different about Kevin because of how he died, that's on you. I know who he was as a person. So, I can't control that. So it took me a long time to figure out that I couldn't control how other people were going to react. So I had to get to that place first.
Oh, so understandably. First of all, let me go back to the very beginning of what you said, which is that it is people's first question. Heather, who's in this room, Heather and I didn't know at first either. We still don't know to this day. I'm not 9 years out, I believe. Heather's 6 years out. But it was the first question, and we didn't know. I was full of guilt. Like, I was sure I did something wrong, and that being asked over and over and over and over again felt like it was going to nearly kill me, literally. So, but on the bright side, I started writing because of it. I thought, I can't tell this story over and over again. I'm going to literally die if I have to tell this story again. And so I guess a silver lining is that it did spawn my writing. I thought, I'm just going to write it down. People can read it if they want. They don't have to read it if they don't want. I don't care if they read it or not. But that way, I don't have to tell this story over and over again verbally, it was exhausting for me to talk about anything, much less that. But you're right, that is the first question that people ask, even when it's a celebrity. It's just the first thing that people ask. And I don't think that most people realize how intrusive and hurtful that is. That it often comes before, is there anything I can do? I'm so sorry. How are you holding up? It comes up before any outward showing of empathy a lot of times, which is hard, and especially if the question is coming from someone that you love and respect. So I just wanted to acknowledge that first. And then I love this line that you wrote, Susan. How he died will determine how he is remembered by people and how they view me as a mother. And that is unfortunately true, although it's wrong. It's completely wrong. In my book, I write a little bit about judgment. It took me a little longer than you to even realize I was being possibly judged. I was so in shock at first that my brain was broken, which was a gift, actually. Because while my brain was broken, as I've said before, I didn't have to try not to care what people thought. I just didn't. And it felt like a superpower. That wears off, unfortunately, and then you can start to feel the judgment around you. And I remember thinking, when certain people I could tell were possibly judging me, all I could think was, oh my God, I've seen you go on an 80-post tirade about bad service in a restaurant, and you can't extend the smallest moment of empathy for the loss of my daughter. And so I decided I just had to not really cut those people off, but I had to, and not even really walk away, but I had to focus my attention elsewhere, or I knew I wasn't going to make it. But I love that line that you wrote, and I'm also deeply sorry that you had to write it. And that's part of why I want to do this show, to help educate people. As I've said many times on the show, we are a grief illiterate society. People just don't know what to do or say or anything when someone dies, or when one of their friends loses someone close to them, or their family member loses someone close. And I really think we need to have more conversations like this so that people can learn without being felt like they're being scolded. If you're just kind of saying it into the ether, it's not so seemingly pointed at someone, and hopefully they can realize, like, oh, I've done that. I didn't realize it could have been hurtful, and then they'll make a concerted effort not to do that in the future, is my hope. That when people hear things like this, when we share our stories and are vulnerable with our experience with it, folks will see that your feelings, Susan, and my feelings on it are pretty common amongst bereaved parents and the bereaved in general. And hopefully we can start to see a sea change. You mentioned that it took you 2 years. And I also just want to say about that, it should take us as long as it takes us. You understandably had to get okay with it in yourself before you'd want to tell anyone else. I completely, I imagine that everyone in this room can empathize with that. Let's throw up some hearts for Susan, if you can empathize with that. That, I know that if I would have found out something about Alice's death, if I would have found out that there was a cause and it ended up being something I could have prevented, I don't know that I would have been able to tell anyone, because I was so crippled. I was already so crippled with guilt and self-punishing behavior that I don't know what would have happened to me. So I totally understand where you're coming from there. And 2 years is yours, and to take as long, that we should all take as long as we need to get okay with it. But I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the things that occurred that helped you get to a place where you felt like you could share it.
Well, the first thing I did, and just intuitively, I think because when we're out in public all the time, whether we're at work or at the grocery store, it takes every cell, every molecule in your body to try not to fall apart. And nobody wants to see us crying. They want to see us feeling better. I don't want to be a spectacle, in the grocery store. So I was always trying to keep my stuff together. And so I would go in Kevin's room every day, and I literally scheduled time to cry. And it sounds odd to say because, people are like, well, weren't you crying anyway? But it really, I didn't want to necessarily cry in front of my husband, because then he would feel like he had to comfort me, and I knew he was going through it. So it's just a big mushroom effect. So I would go in Kevin's room every day. I would bring in his music. I would bring in pictures, and I would just completely come undone. I brought the dogs in with me. They were the only ones that I felt were 100% non-judgmental. So they got to come in. And I would just cry. And some days I would be in there for 2 hours, and I would come out completely spent. And that was the number one best thing that I could do, because it freed up, the tears and the attention that I was giving my grief actually created space in my mind, in my body. I could just feel it, that I was then able to go out and maybe take a shower, wash my hair, make a phone call, go get an errand done. So I felt like when I didn't do that, right? I did it every day, but there were some days that I didn't do it. And when I didn't do it, I felt more blindsided by my grief. And I think of it like a cup that's completely full, and one little bump, one little wrong look or something, and I would come completely undone. But if I gave myself that time to really empty the cup and really just kind of write, I got to a point where I was journaling, I was talking to Kevin, I was, trying to figure out how to connect with Kevin. And that really just freed up space for me. And I did that for several years. So that was the number one thing. Getting out in nature, going to support groups. I did go to a compassionate friends support group in the beginning, which for me was very practical, and that the David Kessler quote, your grief has to be witnessed. I never shared how Kevin died in those support group meetings, but it was helpful for me to be around other people that knew the depth of my pain. And it just felt like I didn't have to put on a phony face. I could cry if I wanted to the whole time. It was just really helpful in that way. But it was interesting because I went there for maybe 6 months. And, each time I would tell my story. And it was like suddenly I got to a point where I don't need to go and tell my story anymore. I feel like I've been heard. I've got it out. And now I just want to know how to, continue that relationship with Kevin. So I started taking, classes, and I found another support group, Helping Parents Heal, which is more spiritually based. Talks a lot about signs, because I was getting a lot of signs from Kevin. So that's where my energy started going to, kind of keeping up or figuring out how to better connect with Kevin. So those were things that I found to be the most helpful in those first few years.
Thank you for sharing that, Susan. I'm going to call, I think Crystal had her hand up and maybe Michelle did also. But before I go to them, I just wanted to say, while I didn't schedule time to cry, I did notice after a while that I seemed to, and I let it out pretty, right? It's probably obvious. I'm not someone that can keep my emotions under wraps that well at the best of times. So I didn't really, and I also kind of thought, you know what? Screw you if you don't like it. If I don't get to cry when my kid dies, when do I get to cry? If you don't like it, you can leave the room. Maureen was on here a few weeks ago, and she spoke about feeling bomb-proof after her child died, and I could relate to that. I really felt like if they don't like it, they can go somewhere else. This is my child. This is an absolutely understandable reason to grieve, and there's nothing wrong with grieving. All the problems stem from not grieving. But I did notice, though I didn't schedule the time, my crying came when I was alone. I didn't intend it to be that way. Sometimes I was driving and crying. Sometimes I was sweeping and crying. Sometimes I was hiking and crying. But I was almost always alone. And I realized that I was doing it unconsciously. And then when I broke down why that might be, I realized that it was just efficient. I value efficiency, perhaps too much. I love me some efficiency. But like you were saying, Susan, I didn't have to explain it to anyone. I didn't have to look at someone's face staring at me in desperation, like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I knew they didn't know what to do, and I knew they didn't know what to say. And I didn't want them to feel like they had to do or say the magic thing that was going to stop me from crying, because the crying was the thing that needed to happen for me to go forward in my life, and for anyone to go forward in their life. It's the not crying that causes the problems. It's the not grieving that causes the problems. It's the stunted release of emotions that cause the problems. That my tears aren't going to hurt anyone. They don't hurt me, and they don't hurt anyone else unless they decide to let it. And then that's on them, is kind of how I saw it. And then I also can deeply relate to you going into the spiritual. I have a chapter in my book about how I went way down deep in my woo-woo. I've always been a scientist in various ways, but I've also been interested in the esoteric and spiritual side of life. And because I guess we didn't know why Alice died, when logic leaves the room, that just leaves the woo-woo. And I went way, 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 way down deep in my woo-woo, and it really helped me. So yay for the woo-woo. Crystal, did you have a question or a comment?
I found hello, first of all, sorry. I found
Hello.
when
And Crystal's an author also, and maybe she can tell us about her book as well.
I found that my book was the only way that I could express myself. I tried counseling and it didn't work. I went to probably about 14 different counselors, and I tried. The only groups that helped me were the couple that I joined on Twitter, and I named my book after the one group, A Rebel with a Cause. And it explains right from when I found out I was pregnant with Keisha, who died October 2nd, 2020. And it's coming up on her 2 years. And I was probably numb right up until March of this year. And I didn't know how to express myself. I would never cry in front of my kids and my grandkids. I had to send my grandkids to family members because they look so much like Keisha that I just couldn't do it. I found out how she died and what was the cause and everything. And it took me probably a good 6 months to not want to be vengeful and not want to just completely break. I don't think I've actually had time to grieve alone because I have 4 kids still. And it's just, I found when I wrote the book, because I'm a creative person to begin with, but when I wrote the book, I had a lot of people stating, you're profiting off your daughter's death. And that's not what it was. It was literally, I needed an outlet to let it out. And I didn't.
Let me at them.
I needed to just let it out. And I didn't. And I still don't, like, when people ask me, like, how many kids do you have? I'm like, well, 3, but one's not here. Or they see, like, the grandkids and they're like, your youngest daughter seems a little young to have kids. And then I live in a very judgmental city, I guess you would say. And it has a very small town mentality. And it was just, it's still hard. And people are like, okay, you should get over it by now. And I'm like, I swear a lot, like a lot. I'm going through custody for my grandkids against this, pardon my language, sperm donor. And
we speak French here. You can cuss away. We don't
it's
care.
been interesting to see how people view me now, and I don't care, but I've always been one to stand up for others. But when I needed it, it was the hearts of strangers that helped me, not family, not friends. My book was, music helped me a lot, and just knowing. And then finding out how Keisha died was just, it was impossible to comprehend. And I tried everything that day. She developed pneumonia in June of 2020. And the doctor didn't refill the prescription and said that the fluid in her lungs would dry up with the summer heat, which is asinine. And she was going to her baby daddy's house, who is a jerk. Yeah. Anyway, he had rotting food through his house, and she inhaled it, and she had 170 mold spores in one lung, and it clogged her airway, which caused a massive lung spasm, which caused a massive asthma attack. And the doctor said, like, there was nothing I could do that day. I tried mouth to mouth. I tried chest compressions. Everything, and there was nothing that worked. And I blamed myself forever. I forgot 911, but I blamed myself, and I still do. And I felt for the longest time that I couldn't laugh because she's not here to laugh with me. And whether you're a Trump fan or not, this is not a political thing, I understand. But Keisha and I used to throw our slippers at the screen, like at the TV when Trump was talking, because we couldn't stand him. We're Canadian. And I found those slippers like 6 months after she died. And yes, I do clean my house, but I didn't look where the slippers were. And I just started bawling, and I sent everybody out of the room because I'm still scared to cry in front of my kids because they need me. And I feel if they see me break down, there's nothing that is, I could go deeper, and I don't want that because I'm afraid of what will happen.
I'm so sorry for the loss of your daughter. I just want to say that there's so much trauma, right, when our child dies, and finding an outlet, whether it's writing your book or whatever, that's the $1 million ticket. It's like, how do I do this? I said so many times, somebody just give me the directions on how to do it. And, it's everybody has their own directions, unfortunately. So for you, if it's, you're creative and you get it out in your book, and find strangers and other groups that, weren't known to you before, that is the silver lining to finding ways to cope with it and have other people show up for you. And I don't know, maybe Melissa can talk more about EMDR, or, going through the trauma of seeing your child. Thankfully did not have to go through that, but I could not even imagine the depth of the trauma from that. So I just wanted to say that am very, very sorry.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Crystal, for sharing. I'm really happy that you're here, and I'm happy that I met you in our Twitter group, and I'm happy that you're finding some support somewhere. One of the things I noticed after Alice died is that I was very lucky. I had an immense amount of support from day one. But the people who were the most there in those early days were not necessarily the people that were the most there for me 3 months later or 3 years later or whenever. So I had to learn how to just let it come and let it go, which I think Thich Nhat Hanh has a lot of books about. Allow it to come, allow it to go. Sounds so easy. It's so much harder than it sounds, however. But I realized when I could do that the right support for me would show up at the right time. And it was often from a very unexpected place. But it was often, or an unexpected person, but it was exactly what I needed at that time. And I also had to learn how to be really honest about where I was and to ask for what I needed. And I also had to learn how to handle what wasn't working for me. I've talked about this on the show before. In the very early days afterwards, I developed the smile, hug 'em, walk away. If somebody said something the thing that was really hard for me right after was, oh, it's okay, she's an angel now. Well, I guess God needed an angel. And I thought, if God is who you say God is, God can make his own damn angel and doesn't need to smite my 2-year-old to make an angel. So I knew they meant well. And I knew they loved her also. And I knew they loved me. And I knew they didn't know what to do because our society is so bad at this. And so I just smiled, hugged them, and walked away. I knew they didn't mean to hurt me or make it worse for me, but it was. And so I just thought, I'll smile, thank them, and walk towards something that's more helpful. And that's what I started doing. And I noticed the more I did that, the more the support that did work for me had room to come in. So anyway, that's what I did. Michelle, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, it was just a comment. I just wanted to say that I just want to say how sad it is, that it's kind of instilled in society that there's a hierarchy of grief. And, just to remind everyone that nobody's, better or worse than anyone else. And a life is a life. And, everyone matters. No matter how anybody died, everyone's the same. And it did hurt me that when it's like, the judgment, and it's sad. We're all humans, and that's all I've got to say. But thank you for this.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for your deep empathy and your tireless advocacy for mental health issues. People should check out Michelle's page. She does a lot of beautiful advocacy work and is just a sweetheart. Susan, I also wanted to talk to you about grief shaming. So we've discussed the shame in ourselves during grief, and we've also kind of touched on people grief shaming and that grief Olympics that Michelle just alluded to. And Susan, you talk about this in your book, where people with the platitudes, I think you talk about, and grief shaming also a lot of times sounds like, well, at least you have another child. Well, at least you blah, blah, blah. Well, at least you're young. Well, at least you have grandchildren. Well, at least you have, or forced platitudes, which we've talked about many times on this show. And I just wanted to talk to you about your experience with that and how it made you feel and how you learned to go on and handle those situations.
Yeah, I had one experience very early on when somebody was very direct with what they said to me. We were talking I write about this in my book, when Scott Weiland died. He was the lead singer for Stone Temple Pilots, and they didn't immediately release the cause of death, but he was a known heroin user for years, in and out of jail. And this guy that I worked with came up to me once they did release the cause of death, and he said, Scott Weiland died of an overdose. No surprise there. And I just held my breath because I was so, we hadn't had the toxicology results yet, but I was so nervous that it was written all over my face. And when I didn't answer him, he just kind of, knocked on my desk, knocked his knuckles, very casually, and walked away and said, well, one more drug addict off the streets. This was a good thing. I mean, it was one less problem we had to worry about as a society. And I thought, I didn't say anything. I didn't correct him. I did nothing. I stuffed it. And I think when when people casually say, oh, so-and-so died, it's same thing with suicide, anything that is because of whatever the choices that person made that died. When they say things like that, it's just becomes pervasive, and just, your comments kind of, how do I want to say it? They just become the way of thinking. And it's like, oh yeah, well, we don't have to worry about him. I learned in my grief support groups that I went to that I thought I was the only one that had this, shaming problem. But I learned, I listened to a mom who's had a baby, died of SIDS. I listened to her say, if I had just not done that load of laundry, and if I had just checked on her a little sooner. I listened to a dad say, I knew he was having a problem. I could feel it. I should have pushed him to go see that, get a second opinion or get him into treatment and it's like, if we knew what the magic thing was to keep our child alive, we would have done it. We 100% would have done it. So I think once I understood that, I think it must have been David Kessler, because I'm a huge fan of his. I say he's like Mr. Rogers for people in grief. I mean, his voice is so soothing. But yeah, when other people say stuff like that, I think it was a way, it was how I decided how I was going to lead. How I lead in grief is I'm trying to tell stories about Kevin and humanize it. Because I feel like if I humanize it, you can't think of him as a statistic anymore. I want to get the stories out. I want to make, when I wrote my book, I wanted people in the end to know who he was as a person. He was no angel. He got himself into a fair amount of trouble, but he had a wonderful heart. He was open-minded. He was friendly to a fault. So you walk away with that and you say, this kid's human. This kid was a human. He made a mistake. And I don't know, maybe I'm kind of going off topic here, but I just wanted to say one more thing. If he, I just lost it. Damn. I hate when that happens. Okay, I will stop for now.
Thank you for sharing that. And yes, I don't think that there's any parent who loses a kid that doesn't go through some amount of, if I had done this, if I had done this, if I had done this, which touches on magical thinking. I know that I did that a lot, and then I put all of that magical thinking into the guilt basket. If there are different stages of grieving, I skipped all of them and went right into guilt or self-directed anger. That was where I put all my chips. I had all my chips there, and I knew how poisonous it was. I could tell. I could tell it would kill me. So I knew I had to get on that right away. But I think Crystal, we lost Crystal, but I'll tell Crystal about EMDR after we get off. But now we have Mr. JB back, and let's see if we have a better connection for Mr. JB.
Okay, I'm not really sure why Twitter hates me. Well, yeah, I do. I know why they hate me. Because I do a lot of activism, and I'm active for the wrong reasons as far as Twitter's concerned. But I wanted to speak about grief. I've had 22 years of grief. I lost my wife and son in a car accident in 2000. And grief for every single individual is a different thing. We handle it differently. I'm not against anybody writing books or reading books, but I don't think there's a magic book or a magic way to handle grief. It really depends on the person who is involved in the traumatic incident and how they handle it. For myself, which is the only example I can give, I was angry. I was extremely angry. I was angry at everybody and everything. Sitting in a room full of people and talking to strangers wasn't for me. A one-on-one conversation with a therapist or psychologist or a counselor wasn't for me. I'm a private individual. I don't think I have actually shared my experience with anyone totally ever. And I internalized everything. And the only way for me to get through being the type of person I am and I was to journal. I started a few months after I lost both of them journaling, and I have over 20,000 journals now, but I stopped journaling about 9 months ago because I got to the point where I had said all I had to say and I had taken the journey from being angry and hurt and blaming myself, not to acceptance, but just to deciding to try to live life for myself, because for the past 22 years I lived it for my two lost souls. And guilt is a very strong emotion to deal with. They died because they were driving. My wife was driving from our house in Sugarloaf Key, Florida, to Chicago to see her parents. And it was supposed to be a road trip for the three of us. Last minute, I stayed back to do some work for a client. I would have been driving. They would still be alive if I had not been a slave to making a buck. If I had just been more in tune to doing what I wanted to do, which was take this road trip, instead of saying, hey, I'll catch a flight, I'll catch up with you guys in Chicago, they'd still be here. That is what I dealt with for 22 years, the guilt of that split-second decision to let her take a trip she'd taken many times before, but this time it just ended different. And you can't help but put that guilt on yourself because it's all that's in your head. And I had to deal with that all these years. And journaling was one way I did it. The other way I did it was hitting a heavy bag and hitting a speed bag and working out until I was exhausted to the point of passing out. But these are the ways I handled it. I'm very unconventional when it comes to this grief thing, and I understand that because I listen to so many people in so many spaces and so many people just in conversation talk about how they handled their grief, their guilt, and their loss. Mine was hatred. I just turned evil, and I was angry, and I knew I had to find a way to deal with that before I disintegrate, self-destruct. I'm not saying that my way will work for anybody but myself, but I had people tell me that, like the young woman said earlier, get over it, get past it, get on with your life. They're in a better place. I wanted to strangle those people. Every time they said that, I wanted to strike out and just tell them, you don't understand anything about this grief, because if you did, those words wouldn't even come to your mind, let alone come out of your mouth. But we find ways to deal with this stuff if we're going to be a survivor. If we're not going to let the grief and the loss and the tragedy take us down to nothing, we find ways to survive. And I just wanted to say to the people in this space, whatever works for you is what you have to do. What works for one person is not going to work for anybody else. And don't let people tell you things that they think are helping you when you know they're not helping you. I would just simply walk away when somebody started with the they're in a better place thing, because they're not in a better place. I hated everything about the world for a while because these were two good people. They should not be gone. And you can't explain away the fact that they are gone by saying they're in a better place. There is no better place if they're not with me. And I guess that's what I wanted to just convey. There's no magic book. There's no magic potion. There's nothing that makes this better. And for me, it's been 22 years, and I'm still not good with it. It didn't get any better. I just was able to deal with it better. And I thank for the opportunity to tell this here.
I appreciate so much you sharing your heart and your story, Mr. JB. And you're absolutely right. At the beginning of my book, I say, this is not a guide to grief. This was my guide to grief, and I was spitballing it at best. But I know that the more people, I've always been interested in biography since I was a little kid. If there was someone's work I found interesting, I wanted to know about their life. I wanted to know what helped, what forged that person. And I think we learn a lot about life from not only our own experience, obviously, that's where we learn the most, but from how other people. And so someone who reads Susan's book or my book or Crystal's book or anybody's book, they're not all of it is going to resonate. So that the core issues with bereaved parents are pretty common. The core issues are going to resonate. Our approaches, though, are going to all be different. But at the core of it are people who are trying to figure out how to move forward in life while carrying this heavy load. And if you listen to enough people like we do in this space and through books or however, you will every once in a while someone will say something that makes something click in your head, and you never know what that thing is going to be. And so that's really why I do this, and that's why I share my writing and everything else I do in my daughter's memory, because I know how many people have come to me and said, this thing you said or this thing your guest said made this certain thing click for me, and now I'm doing, whatever, and it's really helping. And that's beautiful. That's all we can do. And I also wanted to say, Mr. JB, boxing is an excellent way to deal with anger. And I've always recommended, even before I had my own enormous grief journey, when I had patients that were really stuck in the anger phase of grief, I prescribed boxing or MMA or martial arts or anything like that. I think it's very helpful for many people. And you're right, it's not going to be helpful for everyone. If someone is depressed, it might not be as helpful. If someone is frail, it might not be as helpful. But you sharing that, someone might listen to that and think, oh, you know what? I never thought of that, but I think that's what I need to do. I think I need to go hit the shit out of a bag for a while, and it might make me feel a little bit better. So we learn by sharing our stories, and I appreciate everyone that shared their story today. There is a article in the chat about what we can do when we find ourselves struggling with shame, and I thought we were going to have time to talk about that, but we're not going to, because we always have so many beautiful things to share with each other. So just, you might want to check it out in the chat. I wanted to give Susan a chance to leave us with any closing remarks, and I'm so grateful, Susan, that you spent this time with us, and to Michelle and Heather and Susan and all of our other speakers and everyone for being here. Susan?
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a comment about Mr. JB, what he said about, no book is going to be the answer. And I agree with that 100%. And I think I just want to echo what you said, Melissa, about, it's a different perspective and it might help somebody in some way. I wrote about my story. It was cathartic for me. And I had a few ideas when I wrote it. I wanted maybe to give somebody else hope to know that I have a life now that has laughter in it. I have joy, and I'm able to acknowledge my grief when it hits me. So I wanted to give somebody hope, because at one point in my journey, I did say, is my life just going to be something to endure? And that was a question that I had to find the answers for myself. So it's I think, helpful to, like Melissa, like you said, to hear other people's experiences and say, okay, maybe that does click for me. I do understand that. And if I can help somebody else by my experience, by sharing my experience, it's healing to me. So I find that to be healing. So it's kind of a win-win. How can I, offer something to somebody else that maybe might help them on their journey. It's not the answer, but there'll be maybe a piece that makes their life a little bit easier. And that's Kevin's legacy.
Amen. That's exactly how I felt. I I felt like I had to write in the beginning. As I said, I mainly did it because I couldn't verbalize the story over and over again. And I thought if I write it down, then they can read it and I don't have to. It was re-traumatizing for me to verbalize the story, which is, I think, a big reason why traditional talk therapy didn't work for me and why trauma therapy was the thing that did work for me. The talk therapy just seemed to make it worse. Yeah, so I wrote to save my breath at first, and then I noticed as I was writing that my executive functioning, my brain was working better, and it felt good because my brain was broken. And it felt good to realize I can string a sentence together. I can make this story beautiful in her memory. I can make her life beautiful when she doesn't get to herself. And if it ever helps just one other human being, that's enough for me. And that is her legacy. So I really resonate with that, Susan, and I really appreciate you sharing your story and opening up about shame and grief. It's every topic around grief is important, but shame and grief I really feel is important because it can become a cancer, and it thrives in secrecy and it grows in secrecy, and it really can complicate our grieving process and elongate it and increase suffering for the person who's experiencing shame. And then throw in some cultural grief shaming on top of it. If you're already feeling shame within you, that can ruin somebody. That can be the final straw for many people. And so this is a really important topic for me. I want people who are struggling with the shame aspect of grief to have some hope that somewhere, maybe not here, maybe not with me, maybe not with their husband or their wife or their sister, but somewhere at some point, working on being able to air that shame kills it. It will die in the light of connection. And go ahead, Susan.
No, I was just going to say that's exactly what happened. Once they started telling people that how Kevin died, it just dissipated for me. And now it's like a mission of mine to help other people and to, bring it out there, shine a light on it and say, look, this is what happened. This is what the questions and all of the missteps that people did, this is what it did to me. And so maybe somebody will rethink, pause before they say, well, what happened? How did he die? And just stay with the fact that the person's loved one just died. Stay with that and not just jump into the questions. Questions just don't belong anywhere because that person, if they haven't offered it, they need that time to process it themselves.
When Keisha died, it took me a long time to find a positive out of it. And that was my way of trying to not closure or happiness or, it was everything happens for a reason. And the way I put it through was she's away from the abuse that she was with her sperm donor boyfriend thing. And she's free. She's not being manipulated. And I had shame, and I still do, for not helping her get out of that situation or help her get away from him. And he had such a pull on her. And when people ask me questions, they're like, how can you sit there and find a positive out of your daughter dying? I was like, because that's the only thing that's keeping me alive, is trying to find something positive out of it. And my book, it in the reviews, people have said that it is helped them understand more about, you know, how to grieve and how to express themselves. And I first made the book to have it as a series. Like other people that were in a group of mine, we would all write our stories and do it that way. And I felt that, you know, people need to know that it's not just, yeah, we lost a child. You know, it's how you deal with it and what things might have helped. And I'm not a religious person at all. Well, I can't say that. But anyway, I found that, you know, people are, you know, they're just going to be cruel no matter what. And that is the part that kills. And I've spoke to Melissa a few times just over messages, and she's helped me so much. And it's just, it's crazy that my own family didn't even know. Yes, I understand they're not going to know how to help, but it's like they didn't even try. And my mom, I don't know if anybody else has this, but you have somebody that acts like they've lost the child. So they take it to a whole new level and kind of make you feel bad for them. And I'm like, I don't know how to process this. And if you have suggestions on that, please let me know.
Yeah, we could do a whole show on that. Heather is in my SUDC group, and we've unfortunately seen many, many, many parents who have dealt with that in their families. So that's a great idea, Crystal. Maybe we'll do a whole show on that alone. But this show, unfortunately, we have to wrap up now. It's a little over the hour. Susan, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. A, thank you for bouncing the room. Michelle, Crystal, Heather, Mr. B, everyone that spoke, everyone that attended, anyone that will listen once this is a podcast. I appreciate you all. And again, shame can't live in the light. And also, you don't have to rush it. You don't have to rush getting it to the light. But just know that there is hope, and there are people that will support you if and when you're ready to tackle that shame. And also, let's help spread the word that grief shaming is just a really not cool thing to do. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Susan, for being here. My heart is with you all.
Thank you, Melissa.
Have a beautiful day.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on the show or my other work, you can check out thisclubsucks.com or melissamarimonroe.com, or you can find me on Twitter at MMeaning. May you experience some gentleness on your path today.